Hi folks, Dave Harper. This is a summary of my paper on wilderness sojourning. The sojourner part is really the focal point, and it gives me another angle to consider a theme that you know I love so well. The specific title is Sojourning Along the Way, Numbers 15, the Law of the Sojourner, and New Testament Theology. And one of the reasons that I picked the Numbers passage, not only because the book really is called In the Wilderness, and one of the refrains is, and God spoke in the wilderness, but because it significantly informs the New Testament. People assume it's in a negative way. In the 10th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul lists a number of examples of idolatry, and he says this about the first generation of people, God's people in Numbers. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Clearly a negative example, but I think it's also a positive example, because the second generation marched and advanced into the promised land, because Numbers records God's people en route from bondage in Egypt to a promised land. So there's positive movement there, and I think that shouldn't be missed in what we often assume is purely a negative example. To be sure, it is a negative example. And in both of these ways, the book of Numbers helps to anchor one of the most significant New Testament themes, the identity of God's people as displaced pilgrims or sojourners. Now, to be sure, the wilderness wanderer motif is not beginning in Numbers. God called Abram in Genesis 12 to go from his country, from his relatives, from his father's house, and Abraham became a sojourner in a foreign land. And the Lord admonished him, know for certain that your seed will be a stranger, in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. So this Hebrew word, ger, variously translated alien, sojourner, and slave. And stranger. Apologize for that. Okay. And so the book of Numbers does record Israel at its most vulnerable point, where an entire generation is displaced, weak, sojourning for a time and in need of hospitality and care. In fact, a whole generation is annihilated. And yet this sojourning motif is developed throughout the Pentateuch. The Hebrew Bible expands upon it. Numbers, though, represents what I'm calling the climax of the development of the identity of God's people as sojourners. Okay? And there's this other facet to that, which is hospitality. And you see that in Numbers 15, the law of the sojourner. If an alien sojourns with you, or one who may be among you throughout your generations, and he wishes to make an offering by fire as a soothing aroma to the Lord, just as you do, so he shall do. As for the assembly, there shall be one statute for you, for the alien who sojourns with you, a perpetual statute throughout your generations. As you are, so shall the alien be before the Lord. There is to be one law, one ordinance for you and for the alien who sojourns with you. So I think one thing that's interesting about this is that there is a glimmer of hope in 15 chapter, verses 14 and 16, which are chapters recording great failure. 14, for example, is the failure of the spies to come back who are quaking with fear and report negatively of the land God has promised. So 15 has this nugget of hope, reminder of the cultic practices that demonstrate God's promise and redemption plan for Israel. And in the midst of that is this law of the sojourner. As you are, so shall the alien or the sojourner be among you. So it's a powerful reminder that part of Israel's identity is not just sojourner, but hospitable host to those who are in a similar circumstance. And that really is a perfect illustration of God's sovereignty, because what we see here is, this is the famous clover leaf that Dr. Meyer likes to talk about, where Israel in the Fertile Crescent is perfectly placed to be host for those traveling from Europe through Asia and Africa. This is a connection point. And they know what it's like to be a sojourner, and therefore they are ideally placed to care for those. Okay. The New Testament draws heavily upon the Old Testament sojourner motif. Foreigner or stranger often refers to Samaritans, Canaanites, and Jesus' ministry invites everyone to join the family of God, that hospitality there, the invitation. And there are two primary terms or synonyms for ger in the New Testament, and the most popular one you see here, xenos, and Jesus introduces it in Matthew. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Okay, so there's that word for stranger, a gloss, if you will, for sojourner or ger, and it denotes a foreigner. And here Jesus is equating the foreigner and hospitality to the foreigner with hospitality to him, to the Savior, to the King. That's a powerful and profound truth. Now, stick with me here for just a second, okay? Because Christ is both the sojourner and the cornerstone for the church reflects his sojourner identity. This connection is made clear at Pentecost. So one of the most intriguing links to the law of the sojourner is in Acts 2, where Pentecost is described as the inauguration of the church age. Okay? What you see here is another synonym for sojourner, proselytos. Okay? It is linked directly to Acts and the passage describing Pentecost through the Septuagint, or the Septuagint. So, a stranger who is sojourning, ger, you see that here. Okay? This passage translated, it's Numbers 15:15, okay, one we just looked at. In the Septuagint, uses this proselytos and proselytos. Okay? Proselyte, right, is how we say it now. Someone who's traveled and then interested in worshiping with the Jews, with Israel. And the interesting thing is that in Acts 2, this word is used in one of its only 2 or 3 times in the entire New Testament. Both Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the portions of Libya near Cyrene, and the people staying in town from Rome, both Judeans and proselytes. So these are among the people who gathered for the great event of Pentecost. And I did a significant word study on this, and just a discussion of how these connections suggest that the author of Luke Acts was reading the Septuagint because of the quotations that he used, and the words that he used are exact as a match. And he's drawing from this term, this thought, that one of the things we see is at Pentecost, God's hospitality to those drawn from many different places, proselytes or sojourners, where he is blessing them with his Spirit, and he is blessing them with his invitation to worship. Okay? In describing strangers and sojourners, this rare choice of proselytos creates this link through the Septuagint with the Old Testament concept of the ger, and the Numbers law of the sojourner. So there's lots of thematic evidence also, not just this neat word trick, because Pentecost addresses both the identity of sojourner and host of God's people. Much more on that in my paper, but I wanted to make it clear in the summary that that was a big part of this link between Old Testament and New. And it's just kind of a unique passage. Okay. And here's the next thing I wanted to say. I'm just hopping around where I did a much more systematic advance through the New Testament. Paul takes this notion of hospitality and invitation a whole different direction, because previously sojourners have specifically addressed people outside the family of God. Paul is the first to address people within the family of God with this name. His address to strangers therefore strikes a different tone from that of the Gospels and Acts. And it makes sense, because after the inauguration of the church age, the Gentiles are being invited into this identity as sojourners. So even in portions of Genesis, Job, Psalms, where people labeled themselves as sojourners, the focal point was always Israel and their responsibility and their identity. But in Ephesians, Paul is writing scripture that for the first time directly addresses a Gentile audience on this subject, saying, remember, you were separate from Christ and excluded from Israel. You were once strangers, but now you are being invited in. Okay? So before, Israel had been characterized as host to sojourners. But now Paul is inviting the sojourners into the fold completely for the first time after the work of Christ, so they can be not only guests, but actually participants in the full identity of God's children. I hope that comes through clearly. It's a little easier to explain in writing. Okay. So what we have here then, if you take this logic one step further, okay, the sojourner mentality is central to the identity and ministry of God's people on earth. And wilderness wandering is therefore essential to developing the character and mentality of a sojourner. Okay? We have to recognize the role that wilderness plays. It's a formative pedagogical role in creation of the identity of God's people. So, in other words, their journey through the wilderness humbled them and helped them recognize they had to depend upon God completely, and it helped them recognize that others needed that and they should be hosts and reflective of the way that God hosted them in the wilderness. Okay? So you all remember Beale, I am sure. He likes to see cycles repeated. And so he has this cycle of the wilderness. And he talks about the fact that it's often the place of judgment and exile. Okay? But there's an interesting twist in the New Testament. It's continuing physical exile for God's people, even though spiritual restoration has begun. Because while Israel sinned in the wilderness and succumbed to temptation, Christ in the wilderness resists sin and defeats temptation. And we can participate in that victory. So, after Jesus defeats the forces of evil as the new Adam, believers participate with him in that victory. Thus, the dire elements of wilderness testing are removed. Never again must whole generations die in the wilderness. But there's still the pedagogical value, that's character formative, that remains there. I think that's another significant step forward. Paul takes us a step forward, and then this theologian Beale, he helps us take a step forward to see, wait a minute, wilderness in a sense itself has been redeemed, so it doesn't have to have that full negative connotation that it has in Numbers. So therefore, to sum up here, I've got the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud there to represent the pedagogical. In the wilderness, everything else is stripped away, all our routines, the culture that we've come to depend upon, our comforts. What else do we have? But God is more present, he's more clear, and our dependence upon him is too. So wilderness experiences may be literal or figurative, and they always involve the formation of identity and the need for hospitality, yet we are mistaken if we assume the purpose of such wandering is primarily for testing or punishment in a negative sense. It is, for sure, but not only. Sojourning is difficult, even potentially deadly, but the Bible shows it's necessary to escape worldly patterns, to depend upon Yahweh, and grow as individuals. Thank you for your time. Enjoyed the semester, and I look very much forward to seeing you all again.